it was surprisingly energetic. Many of the Munich Security Conferences that I've attended in the past, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have been very glum and depressed. And this one was full of bustle and energy, even warmth. People were talking to each other about what needed to be done, and that very much included Europeans and Americans.
Hello everyone, welcome to The Current. My name is Aslı Aydintaşbaş. I'm a fellow at the Center on United States and Europe at Brookings Institution, and I'm here today with Constanze Stelzenmüller, the director of our Center on United States and Europe. Welcome to the show, Constanze.
Thank you, Aslı. Always happy to talk to the citizen of a nation that respects the umlaut.
We both have difficult last names. You've just come back from Munich Security Conference, and we're here to talk about that. I've only been there maybe twice when I was younger and working as a journalist, and it felt like, oh my God, this is a bunch of middle-aged white men talking about NATO all the time. And at the time, it didn't seem all that interesting. But since then, I know Munich has changed, and so has the world. So tell us what you saw last week.
Yes, I have indeed been going to Munich for quite a while, and I've been there for some memorable blow-ups, right, about 9/11, the Afghanistan intervention, the Iraq War, the Putin speech.
Putin's speech in 2007.
In 2007, exactly. This was different. For one, we all remembered the J.D. Vance speech last year, right, where he lambasted Europeans and accused them of mistreating, as it were, or restricting the freedom of speech of the hard-right parties in Europe.
He said the threat is not Russia, it comes from within Europe.
Exactly. Right.
And that came as a shock to the system. And you were there last year.
I was there, but I was in the overflow of the overflow, which is what is par for the course these days, because there are so many people there. It is. So maybe for those people who have a hard time imagining what this is like. This is an old and venerable Bavarian hotel in the middle of town. At this point, the organizers have commandeered about 5 or 6 venues adjacent to it. Now imagine police, not just from Germany, but from the Netherlands and Switzerland as well around it, and snipers on the rooftop.
Wow.
And inside you have a 10-ring circus and crossed with an Oriental bazaar. And there's political theatre taking place on the main stage that is mostly completely choreographed, and then around that is people trying to talk to each other and figure out what's happening and what they need to do, and maybe also doing business.
It sounds a little bit fun for someone who works on foreign policy and defense.
Actually, yes. It has a feeling of summer school, except that it's, in winter and it's cold outside. But there are about 1,000 people, and at peak time between Friday noon and Sunday noon, that means it is almost impossible to get into the main stage rooms and difficult to get through the corridors. So, but that does mean you run into a lot of people serendipitously, which makes it fun again, as you say.
So let's talk about Secretary of State and his speech. As you said, J.D. Vance last year, it really came as a shock to the whole system, to Europeans, and the threat from within is actually what you have become as Europe, was his message. But this year, Secretary Rubio's trip was meant as a reassurance to Europe. That's what the press corps traveling with him wrote even before he arrived in Munich. So what was your take? Tell us what he said first, and then maybe how Europeans reacted. Were they reassured?
So again, I wasn't in the room. I was somewhere outside.
You were in the hallways, which is far more valuable than sitting there, because you were able to get the reactions.
Here's the thing. You can immediately see a video and soon after that get a transcript of the political theater that is scripted. And so you are much better off trying to see the people that you otherwise wouldn't see, talk to them in the corridors and so on. But since I was asked to comment on this for German national radio, I did watch the video immediately. I think, in defense of the people in the room who stood up and clapped, I think when you are in the room, you get caught up in the moment. There was a big American delegation at the front that participated in the standing ovation, and yes, some European ministers did so as well, including German. But I think as soon as the message, the content of the Rubio speech sort of trickled into people's brains, people realized what they had been served, which was, as one writer put it, J.D. Vance with maple syrup. There's different ways of describing it, but that one is memorable. But my point being this, that Marco Rubio framed the alliance as a West that is a white Christian ethno-nationalist project based on interests rather than values. And you know what? That leaves an awful lot of people out in Europe, not just people of the Jewish and Muslim faith, of whom there are many among our citizenry. This is not just migrants. It is pretty surprising to the non-Western guests at the Munich Security Conference to hear that the American administration thinks colonialism, was a great Western achievement. There are some allies that I think that the Trump administration wants to keep on its right side. That didn't work that way.
Well, it was really a strange speech in the sense that, first of all, seeing a standing ovation was weird, but also he called everything that's great about Europe basically foolish ideas. That's the expression he used, including open borders, globalization, and
rule of law.
He called and diversity and its dedication to diversity. These are some of the things that make Europe and living in European cities great today. So people were not exactly reassured outside, but in the room there was this, as you said, political theater with standing ovation. He did not talk about Russia.
No, he did not talk about Ukraine, except in the Q&A. He didn't really mention China. And so, as one of our colleagues, Tom Wright, pointed out in a piece at The Atlantic this week, he really missed out on the genuine challenge and threat to the alliance, which is the increasing cooperation of authoritarian great powers with each other, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. That was shocking to many. There's also one more thing that I must mention as a German, which is a very loud dog whistle to the German hard right when he said, we don't want you to be shackled by guilt and shame. That is a very explicit allusion to the notion of Schuldkult, the cult of guilt that the leaders of the hard right like to intone.
When you say the leaders of the hard right, I assume you're referring to AfD, the far-right party
correct.
That J.D. Vance made a point of meeting in person last year. And then Rubio went on to Hungary after
and
Germany,
Slovakia,
right?
yes.
And
right.
Slovakia, meeting similarly sort of far-right leaders. In one case, Viktor Orban. I know you're working a lot on the rise of far-right in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. So the message, it was quite clear. Demand for a political change of sorts in Europe, MAGAification of the continent.
Well, it certainly looked as though Rubio was saying these are our real allies. He said that working with Hungary, which has extremely close ties to both Russia and China, is an essential U.S. interest. How that computes for American interests, I think, is not for me to explain. It mystifies me. Mm-hmm. But it does feel as though both Vance and Rubio this year are saying the real West in Europe is the hard right. Those are the people that we share values and interests with. And that's very shocking to European viewers, and not just to them.
Well, let's turn to a little bit of gossip to lighten this conversation. Munich also felt like a parade of the Democratic hopefuls. I saw that Gavin Newsom was there, Gretchen Whitmer, AOC, of course. I think I may have seen Chris Murphy in one of the videos.
Yep.
So did you get a chance to listen to any of them? Was there a buzz about Democratic hopefuls? Why were they, and what did Europeans
So I think
hear?
Politico counted a total of 6 Democratic presidential hopefuls for 2028.
We must be missing one or two.
It was supposedly the biggest congressional delegation in a very long time. And there were Republicans there and Democrats, and with a lot of staffers. And let me say the following. Again, I avoided going to see Newsom or AOC. I thought, it's a bit early to be ringing in the presidential campaign, and this is not what I'm in Munich for. I did hear Senator Slotkin on a panel in the main stage who was focused and firm as ever. She, I think, just is a very, very good debater. And
she gave an excellent speech
Yeah.
at Brookings a couple of months ago as well.
Indeed. Remarkable. And I went to a lunch with Member of Congress Jason Crow, which of course was off the record. But I think what I can say is that I had the sense that Americans and Europeans, and this included conservatives, this included members of Congress, but also staffers, were really trying to actually reach out to each other, talk openly and sincerely with each other. And we're very much aware that this is a moment of great risk for the international order.
Now I want to turn to President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, who also made an appearance at Munich. He was also there last few years, I think. What did you hear from him? What was the buzz about Ukraine, given that a few days afterwards, President Trump's envoys were in Geneva meeting the Russian delegation for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine?
Let me phrase this a little differently. I wasn't in the room when Zelensky spoke because the room was so full that I decided to watch it on video afterwards again. But what I gather is that he told his viewers that Ukraine needed specific kinds of weapons, something we all know. He received a warm reception. He received applause. The point about Ukrainian attendance in Munich, I think, is a different one, and you can only sense that when you were there. They had their own dedicated space with a ton of events going on that the Ukrainians put on either on their own or with German and other European partners. There was an overall sense, right? And that's very distinct from what it has been in the years before the Russian full invasion, or even 10 years ago in 2014, when I joined Brookings at the height of what was then the Ukraine crisis.
Crimea, of course,
yes,
the invasion
of Crimea by Russia. And the sense is now that Ukraine is very much part of the European family. That when Europeans talk to Ukraine about Russia's attacks on Ukraine, we are discussing a shared security threat, but also a shared European destiny. That is really quite remarkable. There is just a sense of commonality that can no longer be ignored, and I'm not saying that to make a sort of a values point. It is also due to the fact that the Russians are committing so many overt acts of sabotage across Europe. So that's also why it's shared. The other thing that was notable there was the presence of the Belarusian opposition. Right. Also, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya was there, but also Maria Kolesnikova, recently released from prison. And there, too, my sense is that they're received as part of the family.
Yet, Europe is not really at the negotiating table in talks with Russians.
Very true. And there is, I think, a pervasive sense among Europeans that what is happening between the U.S. and Russia is not in Ukraine's interest and is not in Europe's interest. And so we need to figure out things for ourselves. European leaders were generally careful not to sort of, as we say in German, tear up the tablecloth of the transatlantic
antagonize the American delegation or dignitaries.
No. Chancellor Merz, in his framing speech on the first day of the conference, did say, we have to improve our own defense and security in Germany and in Europe in either way, whether we become more alienated from America or whether we find a basis for working together again. And he explicitly said, we cannot follow you in your MAGA culture war. Rubio gave that speech the following day all the same, which suggests maybe a little bit of tone deafness.
Let's turn to Germany and talk about where things are with Zeitenwende, a reality check, because you did talk about Chancellor Merz's speech. He's obviously been very forthright on European defense since he came to power not too long ago. Where do you think his government is in terms of European defense and Germany's defense? And give it a mark.
Sure. So what I always say is that we seem increasingly across Europe to be able to agree on the necessary policies among experts and policymakers. We know we need to do more for our own deterrence and defense. We know that we are still very much reliant on our ability to purchase weapons from the U.S. for Ukraine and on American strategic enablers and the nuclear extended deterrence. But there is increasingly a feeling of queasy insecurity with regard to the trustworthiness of our American allies, as several people there put it bluntly and in public. And so there is a sense that the challenge may be broader than we think, and that the timeline may have shortened massively. I had the general feeling at this enormous conference, there were about 1,000 people there, that so many people were busy getting things done. Right? It was really quite extraordinary. Very often, the MSC, the Munich Security Conference, has seemed purely like theater, with people sitting back there and passively consuming. Now I had the feeling that they were paying attention to the theater and to the messaging, but at the same time having conversations about what needed to be done. That was remarkable.
So there's a lot more happening behind the headlines, outside of the
yes, and a tremendous sense of energy and action. That is not to say that there's not always something more that we could do. And certainly there are two risks, I think, that our efforts at gearing up our European defense and deterrence sort of, are met with forces of inertia like bureaucracy, balkanization, fragmentation of defense industry, and that we ultimately aren't able to agree about the politics of the policy, right? And there is where I think Merz's speech really fell short and where Europe really needs to deliver, and that is embedding this rearmament of Europe into a much larger project of competitiveness and growth. Only that will prevent the European hard right from painting this as a guns versus butter debate and saying, here again are technocratic elites not paying attention to what the electorate really wants.
So, Constanze, is there one word to describe the few days you've spent in Munich?
Well, it was surprisingly energetic. Many of the Munich Security Conferences that I've attended in the past, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have been very glum and depressed. And this one was full of bustle and energy, and as I just wrote in the introduction of our Center newsletter today, even warmth. People were talking to each other about what needed to be done, and that very much included Europeans and Americans.
So before we wrap up, Constanze, any more gossip?
Well, one of the charms, if I dare call it that, of the Munich Security Conference is that, again, you have all these serendipitous encounters and you run into events that you didn't think would be interesting and suddenly they are.
And into people.
Right? And into people that you know and new people. And so I had a lot of that. I think in general, I would say there was a lot of new topics raised by President Trump's grab for Greenland. Right? In previous years, there would never have been a side event on the security of the North Atlantic with a Danish admiral and a German admiral. There would not have been that many events on Arctic and Nordic security. Also, I have never seen so many Icelanders at this conference. And there are always something that may surprise viewers. There are always a lot of civil society and even religious dignitaries at this conference. And perhaps I'll end on this note. There was a Catholic prelate who was praising the Enlightenment and hoping that his church would be a focal point for integration and inclusion in Europe. And I think that was a highly deliberate message as a counterweight to some of the things that had been said on the main stage.
Well, that seems like a really good place to end. Thank you for this wonderful and colorful conversation, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in. You can learn about all of this on our website, brookings.edu, and my name is Aslı Aydintaşbaş. This is The Current.